Rome destroyed Carthage. Rome absorbed Macedon. Rome shattered the Seleucid world that had once claimed Alexander's inheritance. In Caesar's age, Gaul was being forced into the Roman orbit by organized violence on a continental scale. Across the Mediterranean, the pattern seemed relentless, almost mathematical. A rival appeared. Rome studied it, divided it, defeated it, annexed it, and folded its territory into the expanding architecture of Roman power. That rhythm became so familiar that it began to feel less like strategy than destiny. And yet, beyond Syria, beyond the Euphrates, Rome encountered a power it could strike, invade, and even disgrace in moments of triumph, but never fully solve. I'm Professor Adrian Lockwell, and this is Archives of Humanity. This is the story of the empire that turned Rome's eastern frontier into a recurring strategic hazard rather than a completed conquest. Not a mystical barrier, not a romantic one, a political barrier, a military barrier, a civilizational barrier. The problem was not that Rome suddenly became weak. The problem was that Rome met a form of power that did not yield to the kind of war Rome understood best. Rome could conquer kingdoms but not master the frontier system behind Parthia. That is the central paradox. When Rome entered the Near East, it did not arrive as an anxious state gambling on uncertain expansion. It arrived with generations of accumulated prestige and an almost terrifying confidence in its own method. By 146 BC, Carthage had been erased as an independent great power. Macedon had been reduced and absorbed into Roman control. The Seleucid monarchy, once among the grand successor states of Alexander, had been pushed into weakness and fragmentation. Then Pompey reorganized the East, Syria fell under Roman rule, and Caesar's victories in the West added even more force to a political culture already intoxicated by conquest. Rome had ample reason to believe that history moved outward under Roman command, and that every frontier was merely a delay in the process. Parthia disrupted that belief at its foundation. Parthia is too often reduced to a supporting role in Roman history, as though it were merely the source of horse archers, embarrassing defeats, and exotic resistance on the far side of the Euphrates. That is not serious history. Parthia was the eastern rival that repeatedly denied Rome the kind of war Rome wanted. Rome excelled in contests that could end with a broken army, a captured capital, a toppled ruler, and a new administrative order. Parthia refused that clarity. It answered Roman pressure with depth instead of closure, mobility instead of fixed submission, and a political structure elastic enough to survive blows that might have destroyed more centralized states. That pattern would reveal itself again and again. In 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome, marched east chasing the kind of military glory that had elevated Caesar and Pompey. Near Carrhae, he found not triumph, but one of the most devastating defeats in Roman memory. In 36 BC, Mark Antony attempted the same theater on a grand scale, driven by revenge, prestige, and the need to dominate Rome's eastern horizon. He too discovered that entering Parthian space and mastering it were entirely different things. Even Augustus, the great stabilizer of Roman politics, understood the limits of force well enough to transform diplomacy into spectacle, celebrating the recovery of Rome's lost standards in 20 BC as a monumental victory precisely because outright conquest had proven so expensive, so uncertain, and so politically dangerous. And running through this entire struggle was Armenia, the hinge of the frontier. Armenia was never a mere side theater. It was the zone where routes, buffers, dynasties, and imperial prestige collided. Influence there could shield Syria, threaten Mesopotamia, open invasion corridors, or block them. It was the pressure point through which both empires tested one another without always risking total war. The eastern frontier was never just a line. It was a living system of kings, armies, diplomacy, and competing claims to legitimacy. This is why even Roman victories in Mesopotamia so often failed to become durable control. Rome could capture cities. Rome could sack capitals. Roman armies could push deep enough to create the illusion that the old pattern of conquest had finally reasserted itself. But seizing an urban center was not the same as mastering the wider structure that sustained Parthian power. Mesopotamia was not an isolated prize waiting to be annexed. It was part of a broader political ecology shaped by aristocratic influence, mobile warfare, contested loyalties, and lines of power extending far beyond the reach of any single Roman campaign. Rome could penetrate that world. Rome could punish it. Rome could display its eagles where no Roman commander had stood before. Holding it was another matter. So this story is not simply about Carrhae, however famous Carrhae became. That battle was a revelation, not an anomaly. The deeper drama lay in the collision between two incompatible imperial systems. Rome represented a conquest machine of astonishing force, optimized for reduction, absorption, and administrative extension. Parthia represented something different. A looser empire, often divided, at times unstable, but capable of turning distance, mobility, and political flexibility into strategic resilience. Its power did not depend on presenting Rome with a single decisive target. Its survival did not require meeting the legions on Roman terms. Its weaknesses were real, but they were not the weaknesses Rome had learned to exploit most efficiently. There was also a Roman vulnerability hidden inside Roman greatness. Roman elites were not rewarded for caution. They were rewarded for glory, plunder, spectacle, and names remembered for centuries. The East became dangerous not because Rome lacked military power, but because Roman political incentives repeatedly favored dramatic invasion over patient frontier management. That distinction matters. It explains why tactical brilliance could coexist with strategic misunderstanding, and why the strongest state in the Mediterranean could still misread the environment in which it fought. Parthia matters because it exposed the difference between defeating an enemy and comprehending a theater. It forced Rome to confront a truth that great powers rarely accept willingly. Supremacy in one world does not automatically translate into mastery in another. And that truth began to take shape long before Carrhae, in the fractured northeastern margins of the old Seleucid realm, where a frontier people emerged from imperial overstretch and began to build a new eastern power from the debris of a fading order. What confronted Rome in the east had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been forged over generations in the fractures of another empire. In the northeastern reaches of the old Seleucid world, where authority thinned with distance and power traveled less through institutions than through loyalty, speed, and armed reputation, the Parnae emerged from the wider Dahi Confederation as one of the peoples capable of turning instability into advantage. Later tradition centers that transformation on Arsaces I, rising around 247 BC in the region of Parthia after Seleucid control had weakened. The record is fragmentary, and the early chronology remains debated in places, but the larger movement is clear. A frontier people crossed from pressure into possession, and possession into dynasty. That distinction matters. Early Parthian history did not begin in the manner familiar from Roman political memory, with a polished constitutional story and a state explaining itself through law and civic continuity. It emerged from a world far more fluid, where Iranian landed zones, steppe movement, clan structures, and collapsing imperial authority overlapped. Power in that environment belonged to those who could seize opportunity before a distant court could respond. The Seleucid kings ruled an enormous realm stretched across languages, landscapes, and inherited ambitions too large for their grasp. The farther east that realm extended, the harder it became to govern in anything more than name. Governors drifted, satraps tested autonomy. Frontier groups no longer behaved like subjects waiting to be administered. They behaved like political actors studying weakness. In that sense, Parthia was born from imperial fragmentation, but it was not merely a byproduct of collapse. It was an education in how to survive where overextended monarchies failed. Arsaces and the house that took shape around his name appear to have understood something fundamental about power on the margins. Distance is not empty space. Distance is a weapon against the center. It slows orders, dilutes fear, and gives local ambition time to harden into sovereignty. What the Seleucids saw as a remote province, the Arsacids learned to treat as a base. Even so, there was nothing inevitable about their success. Later greatness can make early fragility easy to forget. The first Arsacid state was exposed, limited, and vulnerable to reversal. Antiochus III demonstrated that with brutal clarity. Around 209 BC, during his eastern campaign, the Seleucid king pushed back into the Iranian world and reasserted authority over Parthia, compelling submission. For a moment, the old imperial structure still had enough force to discipline the frontier. That episode strips away every illusion of destiny. Parthia was not marching along a guaranteed path toward empire. It could have been reduced to a subordinate kingdom, absorbed again into Seleucid strategy, or lost in the long graveyard of failed border powers. Its future depended not on fate, but on endurance after setback. The figure who turned endurance into expansion was Mithridates I, ruling from 171 BC to 132 BC. If Arsaces gave the dynasty its founding name, Mithridates gave it historical scale. Under him, Parthia ceased to be merely a successful survivor in the northeast and became a state with imperial momentum. He drove into Media, and that was no ordinary conquest. Media was a strategic hinge in Iran, but it was also a region weighted with older memories of kingship and rule. To control Media was to acquire position, resources, and symbolism at the same time. From there, Parthian power moved into Babylonia, the rich lowland basin whose agricultural wealth, urban networks, and ancient prestige had nourished great empires long before either Rome or the Arsacids mattered. Then came the seizure of Seleucia in 141 BC. That was the moment when expansion became inheritance. Seleucia was one of the great capitals of the Hellenistic East. a city of administration, commerce, and dynastic dignity. This capture meant more than a military victory or a tax gain. It signaled that the Arsacids were no longer raiders from the edge of the map. They were stepping into the ceremonial and political space once occupied by the Seleucids themselves. In the Near East, cities and regions carried accumulated claims. Babylonia was not just fertile land. Seleucia was not just walls and markets. They were containers of legitimacy. Whoever held them could begin speaking the language of empire with credibility. That is why Parthian growth under Mithridates has to be understood as more than territorial enlargement. By occupying former Achaemenid and Seleucid domains, the Arsacids were not simply expanding outward. They were appropriating succession. They were positioning themselves as heirs to the right to rule the East. This was one of the great political transformations of antiquity. A dynasty from the margins mastering enough of the old imperial landscape to claim that it belonged there, not as an intruder, but as a replacement. The capture of the Seleucid king Demetrius II made that transformation impossible to ignore. A dynasty once formed in the shadows of a weakening empire was now taking a Hellenistic monarch prisoner and bargaining at the highest level of interstate power. That was not the behavior of a temporary insurgency. It was the conduct of a rival state conscious of its rank. The old order had not simply lost territory. It had lost monopoly over prestige. Parthia's early rise reveals a pattern that repeats across history. When imperial centers lose control over distance, the frontier does not always dissolve into disorder. Sometimes it learns from the empire, strips it of certainty, and returns carrying a new political form. The Arsacids did exactly that. They learned how to bind mobile warrior traditions to settled wealth, regional elites, and the symbols of ancient monarchy. They took the weakness of Seleucid overstretch and turned it into an operating principle. By the late 2nd century BC, Western Asia no longer revolved around a fading Hellenistic center. It had a new claimant, one with Iranian roots, frontier instincts, and ambitions large enough to command the old imperial stage. The deeper challenge was that Parthia defied the categories Mediterranean observers trusted most. Rome was accustomed to reading power through capitals, provinces, fixed chains of command, and a center that radiated authority in increasingly orderly circles. Parthia could not be read that way. The Arsacid monarchy was a monarchy of precedence, bloodline, and negotiated supremacy, a true king of king's order rather than a tightly centralized administrative machine. The Arsacid ruler stood above subordinate rulers, dynasts, and noble houses, but that height did not eliminate dependence. It made dependence political. Legitimacy came from royal lineage, from victory, from prestige, and from the ability to command recognition across a layered elite world. A king could claim much. He still had to hold the cooperation of men powerful enough to make claims of their own. That aristocratic structure was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The great houses were not ornamental nobles surrounding an absolute throne. They were pillars of Parthian power, regional anchors whose military followings and social prestige helped turn royal ambition into practical rule. The Surena family offers the clearest example. Later tradition remembered the House of Surena as possessing the privilege of crowning Arsacid kings. And whether every ceremonial detail survived exactly as described matters less than the constitutional reality beneath it. A dynasty that must be affirmed by great nobles is not weak by definition. It is operating through partnership, rivalry, and managed equilibrium. To Roman eyes, that could appear loose, unstable, even backward. In strategic terms, it created something more difficult than a simple monarchy to break. When authority is distributed, defeat at one point does not always mean collapse everywhere. That is why Parthia cannot be reduced to horsemen from the east. It was a hybrid empire stitched together from very different sources of strength. In the northeast stood Parthia proper, the homeland from which the Arsacids first emerged. Media formed a crucial highland zone, politically and strategically central, linking the Iranian plateau to the empire's western reaches. Farther down lay Babylonia and the wider Mesopotamian basin, rich in agriculture, thick with settlement, and economically indispensable. These lands were not peripheral prizes. They were the revenue-bearing heartlands that allowed a mounted aristocratic power to operate on an imperial scale. Seleucia on the Tigris represented one face of this order. A major Hellenistic city, Greek-speaking in much of its public life, commercially vibrant, and heir to Seleucid urban prestige. Across from it, Ctesiphon emerged over time as a royal center more closely associated with Arsacid kingship. The pairing was revealing. Parthia did not erase the worlds it conquered. It ruled through them, above them, and sometimes uneasily alongside them. That layered geography produced a layered sovereignty. Iranian warrior nobility, Hellenistic civic traditions, Mesopotamian agrarian wealth, and routes of long-distance exchange all fed the same imperial framework. Caravan networks linking the plateau to wider commercial circuits mattered not only for wealth, but for strategic depth. The empire was not simply a court with cavalry. It was a structure able to draw from cities, estates, tribute, local dynasts, and old habits of rule inherited from earlier Eastern empires. In that sense, Parthia was not a failed imitation of Rome. It was a different answer to the problem of governing a vast and varied Eastern world, one in which direct uniform control over every district mattered less than keeping the major nodes, elites, and corridors within a workable hierarchy. Its armies reflected the same logic. Rome built military power around disciplined heavy infantry that sought decision through controlled collision. Parthia built military power around mobility, distance, and selective concentration. Horse archers formed the flexible outer layer of battle, using composite bows whose force and accuracy made open terrain lethal for slower enemies. Their value was not theatrical. It was operational. They could wear down an opponent, stretch formations, punish pursuit, and refuse the kind of close engagement Roman doctrine preferred. Behind or alongside them stood cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry capable of delivering devastating shock once the enemy had been disordered, exhausted, or drawn into the wrong shape. This was not chaos. It was a coherent combined system built around timing. The way those forces were raised also mattered. Parthian power did not depend on a single uniform standing army in the Roman style. It relied on decentralized mustering through great nobles, regional elites, and aristocratic retinues. That arrangement could produce inconsistency when internal politics fractured. But when cohesion held, it allowed the empire to assemble formidable mounted forces with speed and local knowledge. Noble households were not merely social ornaments. They were military institutions. Their wealth maintained horses, armor, retainers, and the prestige networks necessary for war. That made Parthian military strength inseparable from its political structure. The same elite bargaining that complicated succession also generated the cavalry power that made invasion so dangerous. One detail captures the seriousness of this system. Roman writers later made much of the so-called Parthian shot, the image of mounted archers firing while wheeling away. The image survived because it was memorable. The reality mattered because it was sustainable. Horse archers could maintain punishing rates of fire through organized resupply, including camel-borne stocks of arrows moving with the force. That changes the entire meaning of battle. An army expecting the missile storm to taper off could instead find itself trapped in a deliberate machine of exhaustion. Mobility alone was dangerous. Mobility supported by planning, resupply, and command discipline was far worse. Parthia still had real limits, and those limits are essential to understanding the balance of power. A political order dependent on dynastic legitimacy and noble cooperation could be shaken by rival claimants, court struggles, and aristocratic disobedience. Internal fractures were not rare accidents. They were recurring features of the system. Militarily, the empire was less naturally suited to the heavy siege warfare at which Rome excelled. Parthia could devastate armies in movement, raid deeply, and exploit open country with exceptional skill, but taking fortified cities systematically and converting conquest into dense, uniform administration was another matter. Its strengths were immense, but they were conditional. They required cohesion among elites, favorable terrain, and a form of warfare that kept the empire's mobility at the center of events. That is precisely why the empire proved so hard to solve. A Roman force might seize a city and still fail to possess the political web around it. A Roman statesman might identify a rival claimant and still misunderstand the noble alliances that made kingship real. A Roman victory, in other words, could be tactically impressive and strategically shallow. Parthia looked loose because power was distributed. It looked fragile because authority was negotiated. Yet that apparent looseness gave it depth, and that apparent fragility gave it resilience. The state beyond the Euphrates was not waiting to be overawed like another Hellenistic monarchy. It was built to absorb pressure, bargain under strain, and punish invaders who mistook unfamiliar structure for weakness. Into that misreading, Roman ambition was now about to advance. By 64 BC, Rome had done something that changed the logic of the Eastern world. With Pompey's settlement and the annexation of Syria, the Republic was no longer observing the Near East from a distance. It was now pressed against the Euphrates. That mattered because frontiers do not merely divide powers. They create ambition. Syria brought revenue, prestige, and strategic access, but it also placed Rome beside Armenia, Mesopotamia, and the long corridor of states, cities, and alliances that did not obey Mediterranean rules. In earlier wars, Roman expansion had often followed a familiar sequence. Enter a fractured kingdom, exploit internal rivalries, defeat a field army, impose terms, and convert influence into durable control. Repetition hardened that pattern into expectation. Rome's danger in the East was not weakness. It was the intellectual rigidity produced by success. Marcus Licinius Crassus stood at the center of that rigidity. He possessed wealth on a scale that had already become part of Roman legend, yet Roman aristocratic culture measured men by something harsher than wealth. It measured them by conquest, by triumph, by the ability to leave behind a military memory so large that later generations could not ignore it. Crassus had helped shape the politics of the Republic and stood beside Caesar and Pompey in the first triumvirate, but that equality was unstable. Caesar was winning spectacular glory in Gaul. Pompey had already fashioned an Eastern reputation crowned with triumph. Crassus had influence, but influence was not immortality. The campaign against Parthia emerged from that imbalance. It was less the product of settled grand strategy than of a political system that rewarded dramatic war far more reliably than prudent restraint. That is why the road to Carrhae began in Rome before it ever reached Mesopotamia. The Republic trained ambitious men to seek extraordinary commands, visible victories, and rapid results. A frontier governor who merely preserved equilibrium rarely became a giant of memory. A commander who promised expansion could. Crassus did not need a cautious Eastern policy. He needed a campaign equal in stature to the achievements of his rivals. Carrhae was incubated in the Roman reward structure long before it became a military disaster. Parthia, meanwhile, offered exactly the kind of political picture that invited Roman interference. The Ars Acid realm was passing through dynastic conflict. Oroda II and Mithridates III had struggled for the throne, and from a Roman perspective that pattern looked seductively familiar. Rome had seen divided monarchies before. Civil conflict in a rival court often signaled weakness, an opening, a chance to strike before cohesion returned. On paper, intervention seemed plausible. A monarchy contested at the center could appear vulnerable at the edges. But the Roman reading, while not irrational, was dangerously incomplete. Parthia was not simply a king with obedient territory beneath him. It was a layered system of noble power, dynastic legitimacy, regional depth, and military habits suited to space that Rome did not yet understand. That distinction was decisive. In much of the Mediterranean, internal instability could be converted quickly into conquest because the political and military centers of gravity were relatively exposed. In Parthia, the situation was different. A dynastic quarrel did not automatically dissolve the wider structure. Great houses could bargain, shift, and rival one another while still resisting an invader once foreign troops moved into open country. What Rome interpreted as softness could coexist with fierce operational resilience. The Roman political class had learned to treat visible disorder as an invitation. In the East, that habit became a trap. Crassus crossed the Euphrates in 54 BC with the confidence of a commander entering what he believed was a recognizable script. The crossing itself carried symbolic force. Rome was no longer policing a frontier. It was testing whether the lands beyond could be bent into the same imperial pattern that had worked elsewhere. Some cities submitted. Garrisons were installed. The first movements appeared encouraging. Ancient accounts differ on detail and often write with the wisdom of hindsight, but the larger pattern is unmistakable. Early compliance confirmed the Roman misunderstanding instead of correcting it. Submission looked like allegiance. Occupation looked like control. Access looked like mastery. The campaign was already rewarding false conclusions. The warnings were not absent. The most consequential came from Artavasdes II of Armenia, whose kingdom had every reason to understand the strategic grammar of the region. Artavasdes offered cooperation and urged Crassus to advance through Armenia rather than plunge directly across Mesopotamia. The advice was not born of generosity alone. Armenian kings calculated survival with the same cold precision as every frontier power. But calculation does not make the advice unsound. The Armenian route would have constrained Parthian cavalry freedom, broken the vast openness that favored horse archers, and forced the campaign into terrain less hospitable to the enemy's preferred style of war. Crassus refused it. He chose the Mesopotamian line instead. That choice revealed more than tactical preference. It revealed the mental world of Roman aristocratic war. The Armenian route meant slower movement, deeper dependence on alliance politics, and a campaign less suited to the image of a sweeping, triumphant advance. The Mesopotamian route promised directness. It offered speed, clarity, and the visual logic of invasion. It looked like the road to a decisive result. In reality, it was the road most likely to hand the initiative to Parthian strengths. Roman political ambition favored the dramatic line of advance precisely when the theater punished drama most severely. The intelligence problem widened at every step. Campaigns beyond familiar ground rarely fail only because a commander lacks bravery. They fail because information arrives filtered through distance, self-interest, and wishful interpretation. Figures such as Abgar of Osirhone appear in the tradition as advisors, guides, and intermediaries, though the sources do not always allow certainty about motive or precise conduct. That uncertainty is part of the lesson. Empires moving through contested zones depend on local actors whose loyalties are negotiable and whose survival depends on flexibility. An intermediary can support a great power only up to the point that support remains useful. He can encourage the invader toward the course it already prefers and still preserve deniability if disaster follows. Crassus was not navigating a transparent landscape. He was moving through an intelligence environment clouded by ambition and shaped by men who had every incentive to remain reversible. The deepest Roman mistake, then, was not arrogance in the abstract. Rome had often been arrogant. The more fatal error was analytical. Crassus treated Parthia as another monarchy that could be intimidated by prestige, invaded by momentum, and reduced through a familiar sequence of pressure and compliance. But eastern space did not behave like the Mediterranean. Open terrain multiplied cavalry power. Distance magnified every misjudgment. A looser imperial structure could surrender ground without surrendering the campaign. An army could march forward, seize positions, and still be entering a battle designed by the enemy. By the time Crassus committed himself beyond the Euphrates, the architecture of disaster was already in place. Roman rivalry had chosen the war. Roman precedent had misread the opportunity. Roman impatience had discarded the safer route. And Parthia, under Oroda II, stood ready to let those misunderstandings mature into catastrophe. In 53 BC, near Carrhae in Upper Mesopotamia, Roman ambition met an enemy that did not fight for admiration, only for advantage. Crassus had marched east with the assumptions of a Mediterranean conqueror. Surena met him with the logic of the Iranian frontier. He was no mere cavalry raider elevated by circumstance, but one of the great magnates of the Ars Acid world, a man of immense wealth, hereditary prestige, and political weight. Roman writers such as Plutarch and Cassius Dio, looking back through the shame of defeat, preserved him in dramatic colors. Yet the essential fact lies beneath their rhetoric. Surena understood that Roman strength was formidable, and that precisely because it was formidable it could be trapped inside its own habits. The Roman army remained the most feared infantry machine in the known world. Its power depended on closing distance, fixing the enemy, and turning discipline into physical domination. Once the legions reached decisive range, campaigns often became arguments that only Rome could finish. At Carrhae, that familiar sequence never arrived. The Parthian army was built to deny closure. Horse archers moved in widening arcs, loosing volleys without surrendering contact on Roman terms. Behind them stood the other edge of the system, the cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry whose role was not constant engagement but timed shock. One force exhausted, the other threatened rupture. Together they transformed the battlefield into a moving geometry in which Rome could see the enemy, suffer from the enemy, and still fail to seize the enemy. Crassus answered that problem with caution, but caution in the wrong form can become surrender of initiative. Ancient accounts vary on the exact arrangement, yet the core pattern is clear enough. He compressed his army into a dense defensive formation, prioritizing cohesion against encirclement. That decision protected the legions from immediate fragmentation, but it also reduced their ability to maneuver, narrowed their offensive options, and presented Surena with what he needed most: a large, slow target whose fear of disorder was greater than its capacity for action. The Roman line did not collapse at once. It was made to stand still while defeat accumulated. Then the deeper Roman miscalculation revealed itself. Roman commanders had often treated missile fire as a prelude, an irritation, or at worst a test of nerve before close battle settled the issue. At Carrhae, missile fire became the battle. The arrows did not taper off. They intensified. Surena had prepared for duration, not for spectacle. Camel trains brought fresh arrow stocks, allowing the mounted archers to sustain pressure far beyond what Roman experience had taught them to expect. This detail mattered more than any flourish in later storytelling. It meant that endurance itself became a Parthian weapon. The legions could not simply wait for the storm to pass, because the storm had been organized. Every Roman instinct now worked against Roman success. Infantry could not force a decisive engagement against cavalry that scattered and returned at will. The Roman mounted arm was too weak to pin the enemy. If units pushed outward, they risked isolation. If they remained compact, the volleys continued. Shields and armor preserved life, but they also sentenced men to absorb punishment without reply. Discipline, the source of Roman battlefield superiority, began to serve a crueler function. It kept the army intact inside a system designed to drain its strength, its confidence, and finally its judgment. That judgment cracked with Publius Crassus. Young, aggressive, and already marked by distinction, he represented the Roman answer to humiliation. Strike back, restore momentum, compel the enemy to stand. Whether Surena lured him with feigned withdrawal or whether the pressure of the moment made restraint politically and emotionally impossible, the result was the same. Publius led cavalry and supporting troops away from the main army in pursuit of an opening that did not truly exist. The Parthians extended the distance, stretched the Roman detachment, and then closed the trap. Horse archers consumed cohesion from afar. Cataphracts drove the crisis home when the moment was ripe. What began as a counterstroke became separation, then enclosure, then destruction. Publius died there, and with him vanished the last serious chance that the Romans might recover command of the field. The effect reached far beyond the loss of one wing. Roman morale broke inward. Parthian confidence hardened into certainty. Some ancient accounts dwell on the display of Publius' head before the Roman line. The significance of that scene is not blood, but method. Surena was waging psychological war with the same precision that he waged tactical war. He was demonstrating that Roman valor could be isolated, Roman command could be manipulated, and Roman prestige could be mutilated in public view. Carrhae was becoming more than a defeat. It was becoming a lesson delivered to Rome in the language Rome feared most: impotence. The field did not produce a single neat ending, produced a widening failure. Crassus withdrew survivors toward Carrhae, but retreat in Upper Mesopotamia only extended the battle into time and space. Separated units, uncertain routes, exhaustion, and relentless harassment turned tactical defeat into operational ruin. The army no longer controlled the rhythm of events. It merely endured them. That distinction mattered immensely. Rome had often lost men and still preserved authority through organized withdrawal. Here, even the retreat became an argument for Parthian superiority in this theater. The final act came under the shadow of negotiation. Crassus, exhausted and pressed by troops who could see no path back to initiative, moved toward parley with Surena's side. The surviving accounts disagree in detail, and all are filtered through Roman memory trying to explain an intolerable humiliation. But the broad truth is secure. The meeting collapsed into violence, and Crassus died not as a commander dictating terms, but as the ruined architect of the campaign. The captured standards ensured that Carrhae would never remain a battlefield alone. In Roman political culture, standards were not mere equipment. They carried honor, continuity, and the sacred identity of the legion. Their loss gave the disaster an afterlife in public memory. On the field, Rome had been tactically disarmed by mobility, range, and disciplined refusal of close combat. Across the retreat, it had been operationally undone by terrain, distance, and the inability to restore order in hostile space. In the imagination of the Republic, something even larger had broken. Rome had discovered that its most trusted military grammar did not command every theater, and that an Eastern power could puncture Roman invincibility without conquering Rome itself. That was the true shock of Carrhae. It was not simply that a Roman army had been beaten. Rome had been shown, with brutal clarity, that its way of making war could be strategically disarmed when mobility, intelligence, and environment belonged to the other side. Carrhae did not end Roman ambition in the East. It made that ambition more emotional, more political, and in some ways more dangerous. The defeat became a wound in Roman memory, and wounds of prestige rarely produce caution in a republic still driven by rivalry among great men. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC and Rome collapsed again into civil war, the eastern frontier did what frontiers always do when the center fractures. It exposed how quickly imperial authority could dissolve once attention and force were pulled elsewhere. The Parthian court understood that Roman civil conflict was not a side issue. It was an opening. Under Oroda II, and through the Prince Pacorus, Parthia moved with far greater strategic intelligence than the old Roman caricature of a loose Eastern monarchy would allow. Around 40 BC, Pacorus joined forces with Quintus Labienus, a Roman who had crossed into anti-Roman service after the civil wars. That alliance alone revealed the scale of the crisis. A Roman aristocrat was now helping Parthia break Roman power in the provinces. Syria was overrun. Much of Asia Minor buckled under the pressure. Local elites shifted their calculations with brutal speed, because loyalty on a frontier is never purely sentimental. It rests on protection, on pay, on the visible ability of an empire to arrive in time. That was the real force multiplier behind Parthian expansion. Parthia did not need to conquer the Roman world to destabilize it. It only needed Roman factions to weaken one another, provincial governors to hesitate, and clients to doubt whether Rome could still enforce its promises. Once those cracks appeared, cavalry raids became political shocks. A frontier that looked fixed on a map became fluid in practice. Then came one of the most important corrections in the entire story. Rome was not doomed to fail every time it faced Parthian-led armies. Under the right commander, in the right theater, with limited aims and disciplined execution, Rome could strike back effectively. Publius Ventidius Bassus, operating for Antony, restored a kind of strategic sobriety that had been missing at Carrhae. He first broke Labienus and unraveled the Roman Parthian offensive in Asia Minor. Then in 38 BC, at Mount Gindarus in northern Syria, he met Pacorus and defeated him decisively. The significance of Ventidius lies in what he did not do. He did not chase prestige into open country. He did not offer the Parthians the battle they wanted on terms that favored cavalry freedom. He used terrain more carefully, drew the enemy into conditions less favorable to mounted warfare, and preserved Roman cohesion instead of sacrificing it to theatrical aggression. Pacorus was killed, and with him fell the momentum of the great Parthian thrust westward. This mattered enormously. It proved that Parthian power was formidable, not magical. Rome could defeat it when command matched the environment. But the political economy of Roman glory was rarely satisfied by competent recovery. Ventidius won the kind of campaign that protects states, yet Roman memory favored the kind of campaign that crowns careers. Antony needed something larger. He needed a triumph vast enough to rival Caesar, answer the humiliation of Crassus, and strengthen his position in the struggle for supremacy within Rome itself. That pressure is essential to understanding what followed, because Antony's invasion was not merely a military expedition. It was a strategic design distorted by political time. In 36 BC, Antony launched the Great Eastern Campaign that was supposed to settle the matter. On paper, it was more intelligent than Crassus' Mesopotamian advance. Antony worked through an alliance with Artavasdes of Armenia and chose a northern route through Armenia toward Media Atropatene, avoiding the direct plunge into the open plains that had served Surena so well at Carrhae. The objective centered on Fraspa, a major stronghold in Media Atropatene. By driving deep, reducing fortified resistance, and forcing a political shock across the region, Antony hoped to compel Phraates IV into a decisive settlement. Yet the campaign carried within it the same structural vulnerability in a different form. Rome remained strongest at taking and holding places through heavy force, engineering, and siegecraft. That meant Antony's plan depended on the safe movement of siege equipment and a stable logistical chain over difficult distance. The heart of the invasion was not Antony's courage. It was the survival of his siege train. When that siege train was caught and destroyed, the expedition did not collapse in one theatrical instant. It began to rot. Ancient accounts differ on details, but not on the central meaning. Without the heavy equipment, Antony could approach Fraspa, but he could not reliably break it. Time began working for the defenders. Supplies tightened. Momentum drained away. The campaign that had been designed for a decisive display of Roman power turned into a test of endurance on terms the East habitually imposed on invaders. Coalition warfare then revealed its usual weakness. The alliance with Artavasdes, which had seemed to offer Antony the strategic depth Crassus lacked, became uncertain and brittle under pressure. Armenian support no longer provided the confidence and stability the plan required. Whether through caution, mistrust, or simple political self-preservation, the partnership failed to deliver what the campaign demanded. Antony was left advancing too far with too little certainty behind him. Phraates IV did not need a single annihilating masterpiece to win. Constant harassment was enough. Pressure on supply lines, attacks on vulnerable detachments, exhaustion among men and animals, and the attritional logic of distance did the work. The retreat became the true judgment on Antony's design. Unlike Crassus, Antony was not destroyed in one catastrophic clash. His army was worn down across space, hunger, cold, and repeated attack. That difference is crucial. Rome had learned from Carrhae tactically, but tactical learning did not equal mastery of the theater. Ventidius had shown that Rome could succeed in the East when it accepted limited aims, chose its ground carefully, and treated victory as the management of risk rather than the pursuit of spectacle. Antony showed the opposite. Even after Carrhae, Roman commanders remained vulnerable when political necessity demanded speed, glory, and a grand conclusion that logistics could not sustain. The East did not make Roman victory impossible. It made impatience expensive. And so revenge produced what Rome had not wanted to inherit. Not a final settlement, but a harsher education. Victories were possible. Lasting closure was not. Beyond the battlefield waited a frontier that would be shaped less by one grand conquest than by bargaining, buffers, symbolic restitution, and the unstable question of who would dominate Armenia. What took shape after the great expeditions was not peace in the Roman sense, and not a frontier fixed once and for all by engineering, forts, or proclamations. It was something subtler and, in many ways, more durable. A negotiated system of rivalry in which war remained possible, prestige remained vital, and the spaces between empires were managed as carefully as they were contested. Cities could still be taken, armies could still cross the Euphrates, but the deeper struggle increasingly turned on recognition, hostages, client kings, dynastic marriages, and the careful staging of political superiority. In the East, symbolism was never ornamental. It was part of the machinery of power. Augustus grasped that better than any Roman leader since Carrhae. In 20 BC, the standards lost by Crassus were recovered from Phraates IV. Roman memory treated those standards as more than captured military objects. They embodied humiliation. They were the visible residue of shattered prestige, reminders that Roman arms had once been broken in a theater Rome claimed to master. Augustus did not erase that memory with a grand invasion into the Ars Acid heartland. He did something far more subtle and politically far more effective. He applied pressure through diplomacy, exploited Parthian anxieties over internal stability and dynastic security, and turned negotiation into triumph. No Roman annexation followed. No Parthian monarchy was destroyed. Yet in Rome, the event was staged as vindication. Coinage, monuments, and Augustan language transformed a diplomatic settlement into an image of imperial restoration. The standards returned, and with them Rome's public dignity. That mattered because empires are held together not only by roads, grain, and taxation, but by interpretation. A state that can redefine embarrassment as victory can preserve authority without paying the full cost of conquest. Augustus restored Roman prestige without solving the Eastern problem in military terms. Parthia remained powerful, independent, and fully capable of shaping the balance beyond the Euphrates. The recovery of the standards did not end the contest, clarified its new form. No territory revealed that form more clearly than Armenia. Armenia was not a marginal kingdom trapped between larger empires. It was the hinge of the whole system. Its uplands affected movement between the Caucasus, Upper Mesopotamia, and Media. Its allegiance influenced the security of Syria and Cappadocia. Its throne could open invasion routes, block them, or force both empires into exhausting demonstrations of resolve. For Rome, influence in Armenia offered strategic depth and the chance to keep Eastern pressure at arm's length. For Parthia, influence there prevented encirclement and projected Ars Acid legitimacy into one of the most politically sensitive regions in the Near East. Whoever shaped Armenia did not merely gain a client. That power altered the geometry of the frontier. Because of that, Armenian succession disputes repeatedly became imperial crises. A contested coronation in Artaxata could matter as much as a campaign in Mesopotamia. A prince backed by Rome, a brother supported by the Ars Acids, a hostage exchanged at the right moment, or an insult delivered at the wrong one could destabilize the entire balance. The Roman-Parthian frontier was therefore never just a military border. It was a diplomatic organism, sustained by courts, noble factions, ceremonial rank, and constant bargaining under the shadow of force. A throne influenced was not the same as a frontier secured, but thrones could decide whether armies would march. That logic emerged with unusual clarity in the settlement shaped by Corbulo and Tiridates in the age of Nero. Corbulo was one of Rome's ablest commanders, and his campaigns in the east showed that Roman discipline and operational competence still carried enormous weight. He moved effectively in Armenia, seized key centers, and imposed real pressure. Yet battlefield success did not erase the political structure that made Armenia perpetually contested. Tiridates, brother of the Parthian king Vologases I, became the center of the crisis and then the center of its solution. The arrangement that developed after years of conflict, especially by AD 63, was a masterpiece of managed ambiguity. Tiridates would rule Armenia, but he would receive the crown from Nero. When he came to Rome in AD 66 for the ceremony, each empire could present the outcome as confirmation of its own superiority. Rome displayed the emperor as the source of kingship. Parthia retained an Ars Acid on the Armenian throne. Neither side achieved exclusive mastery. Neither side accepted humiliation. This was not peace born from trust. It was stability produced by a formula both could survive. Even the most spectacular later Roman offensives did not break that logic. Trajan carried Roman ambition farther east than almost any predecessor. He intervened in Armenia in AD 114, pushed through Mesopotamia, and in AD 116 reached Ctesiphon itself. It was a breathtaking demonstration of imperial reach. Provinces were announced. The old Roman dream of Eastern mastery briefly seemed attainable. But occupation and governance are not the same act. Distance, revolt, local complexity, and the burden of sustaining control in a hostile and elastic political environment quickly reasserted themselves. Hadrian's later withdrawal from these exposed acquisitions was not simple caution. It was an acknowledgement that penetrating the system was easier than holding it. A city captured is not a region governed. Septimius Severus proved the same point in a harsher register. In AD 198, he took and sacked Ctesiphon, striking directly at Ars Acid prestige and displaying unmistakable Roman military power. The blow was real, so was its theatrical value, but punitive success did not produce durable annexation. The Parthian world was not organized in a way that guaranteed collapse once a capital was taken. Noble houses, regional power centers, and the broader resilience of the political order allowed recovery even after severe humiliation. Rome could invade, punish, and display supremacy. It still struggled to convert shock into lasting control. The Ars-Acid monarchy, meanwhile, was being strained by forces that had long lived inside its own structure. The same aristocratic order that had given Parthia flexibility against foreign invasion could become dangerous when dynastic conflict sharpened. Great families contested influence. Successions fractured. Regional loyalties pulled against royal cohesion. Rome had not destroyed Parthia, but time, rivalry, and internal strain were wearing the dynasty down. In AD 224, Ardashir defeated the last Ars-Acid ruler and founded the Sasanian Empire. The dynasty fell, yet the eastern frontier remained what it had become over centuries. Not a solved border, but a contested system that outlived the house that first taught Rome how costly that system could be. What emerges in the end is not a story of Roman weakness. It is a story of Roman mismatch. Parthia turned the eastern frontier into a death trap for Roman ambition, not by defeating Rome everywhere, and not by possessing some magical invincibility, but by forcing Roman power to operate under conditions that made its greatest strengths expensive, slow, and politically unsustainable. The legions were formidable. Roman siegecraft was formidable. Roman prestige was formidable. But east of the Euphrates, strength alone did not decide the contest. Distance intervened. Time intervened. Terrain favored movement over enclosure. Political authority flowed through dynasties, nobles, buffers, and negotiated loyalties rather than through the clean territorial logic Rome preferred. In that world, conquest could be real and still not be durable. That is why the Roman record in the East appears so paradoxical. Carrhae did not prove that Rome was powerless. Antony's failure did not prove that Rome could never recover. Augustus did not solve the problem simply because he recovered the standards. Trajan did not solve it by reaching Ctesiphon. Septimius Severus did not solve it by sacking the same center again. Each episode exposed the same truth from a different angle. Rome could invade. Rome could punish. Rome could display supremacy. Rome could even dictate terms for a season. What Rome struggled to do was convert penetration into permanence, spectacle into order, and battlefield success into a settled political system. The causes were not mysterious. They were structural. Roman elite ambition kept dragging Eastern war into the orbit of personal glory, where commanders needed magnificent outcomes faster than the theater could provide them. Intelligence repeatedly failed because Roman leaders often mistook Parthia for the kind of monarchy Rome already knew how to intimidate. They saw a crown and assumed a center of gravity that could be struck once and mastered. They saw open country and assumed space that could be crossed, not a strategic medium that magnified cavalry, weakened supply, and dissolved the certainty of decisive battle. They saw internal division and assumed fragility, when in fact the Ars-Acid world often turned looseness into resilience. A system built on noble houses, dynastic bargaining, regional depth, and elastic recovery could survive shocks that would have broken a more rigid imperial structure. Armenia and Mesopotamia sharpened every one of these problems. They were never marginal territories. They were the hinge zones where prestige, access, buffers, alliance systems, and imperial credibility all converged. To neglect them was dangerous. To dominate them completely was ruinously difficult. That is the strategic trap at the center of the entire story. Rome could not ignore the East because the East affected honor, security, and status. Yet every attempt to settle the matter completely risked feeding the very conditions that made settlement impossible. The deepest lesson reaches beyond antiquity. Great powers lose their bearings when prestige becomes strategy. From that moment onward, leaders begin to chase the victory that looks glorious instead of the equilibrium that actually works. They mistake demonstration for settlement. They confuse retaliation with control. They assume that a dramatic campaign can replace a patient arrangement. Above all, they persuade themselves that a rival with decentralized institutions must also possess shallow endurance. History is full of states that learned too late that resilience does not always look impressive at first glance. Sometimes it looks divided, improvised, and untidy. Then the campaign begins, and that untidiness becomes depth. Parthia understood something essential about superpowers. The strongest system is not always the one with the heaviest army. Often it is the one that most effectively turns geography, politics, and time into weapons. Rome sought finality. Parthia weaponized continuation. Rome preferred a frontier that could be fixed, administered, and claimed. Parthia survived through mobility, layered authority, aristocratic cooperation, buffers, and ambiguity strong enough to exhaust cleaner imperial designs. That is why Parthia matters far beyond the familiar humiliation of Crassus. It revealed a permanent weakness in expansionist power. The belief that superiority in force is the same thing as superiority in strategic comprehension. When the Arsacid house fell in AD 224, the problem did not vanish with the dynasty. The Sasanians inherited more than territory. They inherited a strategic tradition, an Eastern imperial self-confidence, and a tested understanding that Rome could be confronted not merely at the border, but at the level of civilizational rivalry. In that sense, Parthia's greatest victory was not a single battle. It was the creation of a long Eastern equilibrium in which Rome remained formidable, yet never entirely free to impose the kind of final order it preferred. That is the verdict. Rome did not fail in the East because it lacked courage, discipline, or military brilliance. Rome failed to master the East because it repeatedly tried to force a Mediterranean answer onto a different strategic world. And history keeps returning to that pattern because power keeps returning to the same temptation, to believe that winning against an enemy is the same thing as mastering the system that enemy belongs to. If this kind of history matters, subscribe for the next episode, because the channel follows power past the battlefield and into the deeper logic that actually decides civilizations. And continue with the video on the end screen, because it extends this same pattern of empire, strategy, and illusion from another frontier. One question remains worth debating in the comments. What trapped Rome more completely in the East, ambition or misunderstanding?